Good evening and welcome to Environmental Coffee House. And I'm Sandy Jealous, and whoever's with me knows that. I got inspired. I don't plan well as usual, but I like Robert Hunziker's writing. Came out with a new article from Counterpunch. I thought, you know what my drill is. I like to do the article and then I like to have conversation about it. So I'm going to read it. It's pretty good. It's called Ignoring Climate Catastrophes. And I got inspired because I was talking to Chris, Natural Progressive, today, and we were talking about other things. But here I see this and I said, I'm going to do this. I'm going to do it. Hey, Chris, let's add you to the broadcast just to make sure it's yellow. Okay, good. Cool. So let's get started. I'm not going to stay on all night, but yes, Chris got me motivated today. And this article is right up my alley, right up all of our alley, because Robert Hunziker, he's pretty good. He's a good writer. He scares you, but he's good. So let's go. The planet is coming apart. I got to get a comfortable position so my neck doesn't hurt. The planet is coming apart seems right before the eyes of scientists at remote fringe areas of the north where permafrost crumbles and collapses. It's abrupt climate change at work in real time, but the governing leaders of the world either don't care or don't know. If they did, there would be already a worldwide climate Marshall Plan, which we've talked about, to save civilization from early warning signals of utter chaos. Across 9 million square miles at the top of the planet, climate change is writing a brand new chapter. Arctic permafrost isn't thawing gradually, as scientists once predicted. Geologically speaking, it's thawing almost overnight. His source is the Arctic permafrost is thawing fast. That affects us all. National Geographic. And they don't mess around. National Geographic is a pretty reputable, outlet, has been since I could remember. After all, collapsing permafrost is the leading edge. Cataclysmal global warming as it precedes additional catastrophes that follow one after the other, and then another, all of which happen unannounced, known as abrupt climate change events. The modern world's first near catastrophe, the ozone hole in the 80s. You remember that, guys? The ozone hole in the 80s? Which was luckily avoided 40 years ago. More on this fascinating story later, he says. It was the planet's closest brush with nearly total extinction ever since the Permian Triassic event took down 95% of all life. Wow. 252 million years ago. Let me put up. Hello. See, he always writes compelling stuff, and it'll bring conversation after everybody says hi, and I figure out my comfortable zone. Doesn't seem like I have one tonight. I can't seem to get my comfortable zone tonight, so I'm just going to lean this thing on here, and if it all screws up and falls apart, oh well. All right, so we keep going. Meanwhile, the concern is whether cascading permafrost will end up as the world's second near catastrophe, meaning it gets attended to or it will lead to something much worse, as in catastrophes that follow one after the other after the other. Let me tell you today, I listened to Kevin, Black Bear News, and he was talking about the rapid pace of things happening, actually not the rapid pace of things happening, but the fact that we don't hear about the things happening. And that other places are putting together a lot of catastrophic weather events are happening, but we're not hearing them. Mainstream people are not hearing it. Mainstream media is not sharing it. So that's why we do it, right? And thank you, Kevin, if you're out there. I know you're not, probably. It's a Saturday. So Cherysky, Russia, which is the home to the Northeast Science Station at 69 degrees north. And I'm sorry I can't get comfortable. Far above the Arctic Circle is a year-round base for an international research station that studies Arctic biology and climate change. It is 60 miles inland from the East Siberian Sea, which is another high-risk area in the Arctic. In January of 2018, something unheard of happened at Chersky. Or is it Chersky? Cherskiy. The topsoil that has maintained frozen permafrost for eons was not refreezing like it had every year for as long as records were kept. Whereas January in Siberia is normally so brutally cold that human breath can freeze with a tinkling sound that locals refer to as the whisper of stars. 3 years ago, the temperature in the ground above our permafrost was minus 3 degrees Celsius, which is minus 27 degrees Fahrenheit. Sergei Zimov, who is an ecologist, says, then it was minus 2. Then it was minus 1. This year, the temperature was plus 2 degrees. The aforementioned example of abrupt climate change in Siberia is a beckoning out of the north, warning that the past 10,000 years of the Holocene era, earmarked by a Goldilocks wonder world, not too hot, not too cold, has ended. As excessive heat tears apart regions of the planet piece by piece, therefore sounding the alarm and threatening comfy lifestyles in every country in existence today. But is it a warning signal with a short fuse or a long fuse? Hello, Osama. Taking little breaks. Human-generated greenhouse gases. Oh, well, I went too far. Human-generated greenhouse gases have kicked nature into high gear, competing with humanity by emitting tons of methane and carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Even in the winter in Siberia above the Arctic Circle, it's earth-shattering news that should cause sleepless nights for world leaders. But it doesn't alarm them. Otherwise, they'd already be taking emergency measures. And they're not. As it happens, world leadership is sacrificing their constituencies on the altar of fossil fuel profits and a brand of capitalism that recklessly consumes everything in sight. Therefore, emphasizing consequences such as Alaska's North Slope has seen temperatures spike 11 degrees Fahrenheit in 30 years as temperatures hit 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 240 miles above the Arctic Circle, challenging Florida's balmy weather. As the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change struggles to keep up with even faster climate change disaster scenarios that unfold right under our noses, than their noses, the world's leadership looks like a herd of deer frozen in the headlights. Meanwhile, the risks of excessive global warming or heat is not properly understood by the public in following double scary context. Large, abrupt climate changes have repeatedly affected much or all of the Earth, locally reaching as much as 10 degrees C change in 10 years. And that source came from Richard B. Alley, Abrupt Climate Change, Inevitable Surprises, Washington, D.C. in 2002. That description of abrupt climate change, which is actually very scary, by Richard B. Alley, Evan Pugh Professor, Penn State University, is based upon paleoclimatic data. However, the same risk is not considered by the IPCC or included in scientists' models. Thus, it qualifies as one of the least expected climate events. But it has happened in the past, he says, more than once. Phew. Frankly, society can't handle 10 degrees in 10 years, whether locally, as stated by Dr. Alley, or universally. Which prompts the daunting notion of what happens when nature is goosed up by the sudden advent of the human heat machine. 7,500,000 people, 1,400,000,000 gazillion billion cars, 22,500,000 commercial vehicles, 3,500 heavy trucks, 425,000 buses, 39,000 commercial and military airplanes, 62,500 power plants, 996 million cattle, all simultaneously emitting greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. As CO2 emissions set new records year after year after year after year. In all, 80 to 90% of the above listed statistics occurred in only 70 years. Whereas it took modern humans nearly 200,000 years to reach 2 billion in population. He writes prolifically. Today, it's the great acceleration at work. As post-World War II, 5.5 billion newbies foraged the planet. 5.5 billion people since World War II. All within one lifetime, he says. Amazing! As a result, we are the biggest experiment the planet has ever encountered. Meanwhile, scientific knowledge that establishes a firm link between 1, carbon dioxide emissions, and 2, excessive global heat, brings forth far-reaching unknowns for today's carbon dioxide-fueled world. As such, the climate status integrity of the planet has become a gamble. It's become a crapshoot. For example, the temperature. CO2 relationship over the past 400,000 years is sawtoothed, as demonstrated as so clearly in Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth in 2006. We haven't done a thing. When CO2 hits a high of 280 ppm temperatures, like clockwork, increased by 5, hot cycle. And when CO2 hits a low 180 ppm, like clockwork, temperatures decrease by -5, cold cycle, every 100,000 years over the past 400,000 years. Although temperature change, which is the wild card, is all about timing, meaning does it take centuries or decades or years for temperature to react to CO2 levels in the atmosphere? In that regard, Dr. Alley's, quote, 10C in 10 years is not encouraging. But nobody knows for sure what will happen tomorrow. Speaking of which, today's CO2 at 410 plus has powered through nature's rhythmic cycles of 180 low, 280 high over the past 400,000 years. So now what? Good night, Chris. Good night, Chris. Mwah. She's leaving. She's buffering. And she has to go. The natural progressive. Good night. I'm almost ready. Okay, I'm almost finished. He says, now what? We leave it off at now what, though? Okay? So assuming global warming reacts accordingly, one possible scenario in a 4-degree sea world, in which local temperature increases of 5 to 10 degrees will affect many areas, the impact on food production may be catastrophic. And that source is Angus Ian, Facing the Anthropocene, Monthly Review Press in 2016. Today's collapsing permafrost is eerily similar to the circumstances that surround the world's first near catastrophe. The notorious ozone hole, as explained in Chapter 5, the first near catastrophe of Ian Angus's profoundly brilliant and indispensable book. The world has already faced that first near catastrophe, and luckily, we got through it. You know, there's a lot of people that don't even freaking know about that. Similar to ignoring abrupt climate change today, back in the 1970s and 80s, no one predicted the speed and magnitude of the steep decline in levels of ozone because of damage by CFCs produced by DuPont ever since the 1930s. In fact, back in the day, NASA had predicted that ozone levels might decline 5 to 9% by 2050. But surprise, 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 ozone levels dropped by 60% in the 1980s. Scientists were dumbfounded, and they were even scared. Without the protective ozone layer 10 to 20 miles above Earth, which absorbs most of the sun's ultraviolet radiation, life literally burns to a crisp. Psst. In a masterful stroke of good luck, a handful of scientists brought the impending disaster of the ozone hole to the attention of the world community. If not for the British Antarctic Survey that worked on a shoestring budget of $18,000 a year, the world wouldn't have known the threat to all humanity. Since 1957, they monitored the ozone layer from the Haley Bay Observatory in Antarctica, but never suspected human-generated chemicals would attack and destroy the ozone layer. For 50 years, the CFC industry was able to avoid a ban on sales of CFCs due to an absence of hard scientific data showing a decline in ozone levels. In 1979, DuPont officials said no ozone depletion has been detected despite the most sophisticated analysis. All ozone depletion figures to date are computer projections based on a series of uncertain assumptions. Similar to CO2 in the atmosphere today, CFCs have been entering the atmosphere in ever-increasing amounts since the early 1930s. The pre-1980 measurements from Haley Bay undoubtedly included their effect on the ozone layer above the Antarctica. But in 1979, what had been a gradual linear process crossed a tipping point. We got a lot of buzzwords here, right? Tipping points, yes. And became rapid and non-linear, thus giving birth to an abrupt climate change event that could have destroyed life on Earth. Thankfully, the Montreal Protocol on Substances that Deplete the Ozone Layer was signed in 1987. It saved the world from surefire destruction, blindsided by its own chemical devices. So after reviewing the history of CFCs and the ozone layer, Paul Crutzen, I think I follow Paul, Nobel Prize winning atmospheric chemist, commented, "I can only conclude that mankind has been extremely lucky." Now, is permafrost collapse the second near catastrophe or something worse? Hopefully, the answer is not something worse, because similar to the ozone hole crisis, which was solved by a handful of companies and industries implementing a technical fix and banning CFCs, the process of eliminating greenhouse gas emissions is universal. And that requires decades of transforming the global economy, which is a gargantuan task when compared to civilization's first near catastrophe. Similar to the ozone hole, which hit a tipping point 40 years after CFCs began emitting, collapsing permafrost first happens by inches, then by sheet, then by feet, then by portions of miles. And when it is finally recognized as exceeding a tipping point, which is likely what's happening today in Siberia, and throughout the far reaches of the northern hemisphere, where massive levels of permafrost cover 25% of the hemisphere, buried in frozen soil for eons, holding more than twice the amount of greenhouse gases currently in the atmosphere. Permafrost collapse is as alarming, maybe more so, as the ozone hole threat. But only a handful of scientists see it and believe it. Robert Hunziker in Counterpunch. Really good. Food for thought scares me, because when the last statement is made that only a few scientists, is it only going to take a few scientists? Is he giving us hope, saying a few scientists might be the key to unlocking some kind of fix? We all read and know all the stuff that's going on, and we know that there's, there's people working out there on all the techno fixes. We talked about it, but everything seems utopian. It doesn't seem real. He's a good writer. He's a good writer. Hi, Christopher. Let's see. You said, and welcome, returned from a month of travel throughout Southeast Asia. Rainy season failed this year. In Laos, the Mekong River was 50 feet below average, and the heat and humidity were between 37 and 41. It is scary. I mean, I can orate and read or whatever, but it's scary. It does absorb into us. I do tend to follow the Jem Bendel's work and the work that they're building on um, his positive deep adaptation. It is we're all in it. We're all in it. We're all witness to it. And I thought that was a marvelous article to scare the living shit out of you on a Saturday night. And hi, Tanya. The fix is in a change. Is a change in production behavior. Absolutely. There's, production behavior. It's all encompassing. That's why when I say it would be nice to see, instead of this reactionary right wing neoliberal wave that's taken over the world in the last, I don't know, probably 50 years, whatever, to at least have progressive views in powers that can make the changes that, whether or not they really do work, even if it's a crazy techno fix, as long as it doesn't hurt the environment, it's worth a shot. And that's what Robert gave us at the end of that. So basically, that's it for me. It's if anybody has anything else that they want to add to this conversation regarding that article, I'll put the link in after this live stream. And I thank you for all coming tonight and listening to Robert. I hope he might see the narration someday. He writes in Counterpunch, and again, he writes apocalyptically in a way, but there's always some interesting little shards, and I like his stuff too. So everybody have a good night. I see that you're all very quiet. It's Saturday, and peace, and think about this one. And then what are we going to do?